Hi everyone, it's Lisa from I Dream in Soap. Welcome to my channel and thanks for dropping by. Today we're going to be looking at all the issues surrounding trace. So looking at the idea of what is trace, and then also some other things like the problems that you could encounter. So maybe things like what if you get a false trace? And then we'll look at what I think is probably one of the most important aspects, the idea of what is an emulsion and how it differs from trace and how you spot it, and then the various stages of trace and things that can muck your trace up and give you problems with acceleration. So let's start off with trace first of all. I'm sure whether you're a new soaper or an experienced soaper, trace is a term that you hear all of the time. And really all that it refers to is that when you pick up your spatula or whatever you're stirring your soap with, like I am here, is that the soap that you drop down will not sink straight back into the underlying soap, and you'll be able to trace a pattern with it, draw a design or whatever. Now you can get all sorts of levels of trace, or basically thickness of your batter, and all of them have their place, and the level of trace that you get will help you make different types of designs and have different uses in your soaps. And we're going to talk about the different levels of trace later on. Okay, so let's move on and have a look at this thing called false trace. Now, false trace is something that can happen quite early on when you've mixed your lye with your oils, and it seems like you've got to trace really quickly. Your oils will tend to thicken up and you'll think, oh, I'm at trace, I'm going to now pour this into my mould. Now, the problem with this is this is not a true trace. And in fact, your oils and your lye solution have not even bonded together at this stage. So if you did pour this into a mould, they would just separate out again and you'd have a bit of a soapy disaster on your hands. So what causes this false trace? Well, it's just temperature. I can find that with my recipe, if I soap at even just room temperature, which for me can be sort of low 70s, high sort of 60s degrees, I can get false trace in my recipe, and different recipes will work slightly differently. So typically in most recipes, of course there are some that just are a pure 100% olive oil and things, but most recipes do contain some hard oils. Now we collectively group these so-called hard oils together because they're solid at room temperature. And then if you pour some cold lye water in, it starts to solidify these oils back again, and that's why they become thicker. Now my recipe doesn't tend to give me very bad false trace, but it can be an awful lot thicker than this. Now the other way to tell if you've got a false rather than a genuine trace is to have a look at the base of your stick blender. And what you'll see is as soon as you pull it out of the batter that you've got this sort of grainy, horrible texture. And if you have a close look, you'll actually be able to see some of the hardened particles of fat. So what do we do when we've got a false trace? Well, number one, don't panic and just keep going. You can continue to stick blend to blend everything back in again and help it along, but I find that does tend to lead to potentially a thicker trace than you want in the end. So I like to just wait it out. So at the start we know everything is pretty chilly. But as the lye starts to interact with the oils, everything will start to warm up, and that heat will cause those oils to melt down again and turn you back into a nice smooth batter. I'm then just transferring it into a jug that I prefer, purely just because that bucket I was using was a little bit big. So I'm now just giving it a stir with my stick blender turned off, and you can see if we have a look at the consistency, it's now lovely and smooth rather than having any of those horrible bits of lumpy fat in it. So we're now ready to do whatever we want with it. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time in this video talking about how we actually spot emulsion, because I quite often find people do tend to stick blend too much and then wonder why everything accelerates. Now you really want to start checking for emulsion quite early on, probably much earlier than you think you've actually achieved it. Because if the first time you pull your stick blender out everything's emulsified, it probably means you've actually gone too far. Now I'm sure most people are aware of the technique of pulling out the stick blender and looking at the bell of the blender blade to check for emulsion. But the mistake that a lot of people make is not to wait long enough. Now the oils can take anything up to a minute to start splitting apart. So if you just quickly pull your stick blender out and have a look, often people think that things are emulsified, and that's when you can end up with a batter that starts to separate because you thought you had emulsification, but you didn't. So typically I'll pull my stick blender out and then just set it aside and leave it for about a minute, go and do something, and then come back and have a look at it and see if my oils have broken apart. Now hopefully you can see here when you look at the bell of my stick blender that these oils are starting to separate, so I'm not yet at emulsion. So we're just going to carry on very carefully, mixing perhaps tiny weeny little bursts with the stick blender, but typically by now I'll just stir with the blender, or I'll hand stir with a spatula, or even just let the batter sit and wait till it actually comes to emulsion on its own. So what we're looking for is a thin film of batter, not too thick, but it shouldn't be watery and just run off of your stick blender, that holds its consistency and doesn't break apart. So if I just bring back in that image of where we checked earlier, hopefully you can see the difference between the two. Now if you struggle to see emulsion on the base of a stick blender, I've got another couple of ways that you can try. The first of those is to use a large stainless steel spoon, and that gives you a much broader surface area to have a look at, and you should be able to see the emulsion a bit clearer. Another way that works really well if you use a fairly clear container when you mix up your soap is to roll the batter around the edge of the jug that you're using. And then you can look at the wall of the jug, which is another nice big surface area, to see if you've got your emulsion. So now let's move on to the types of trace. Now you'll often hear the terms thin trace, medium trace, thick trace. Now trace doesn't work in stages. You don't get a thin trace, then a medium trace and a thick trace. It is actually just a sliding scale that the more you blend, or the longer your lye is mixed with your oils, the thicker and thicker your trace will actually get. So what I've got at the moment in my jug is just an emulsified batter. As I pick up my spatula and I drop the soap back into the batter, it just completely just floods back in and is lost. Should you pour your soap at this stage? Well, as long as a soap batter is actually emulsified, it will turn to soap and it won't split away again. The problem with pouring at such a thin batter, i.e. before you've got any trace at all, is that you're going to have no distinction between your colours. Everything is literally just going to flood together and mottle together and be very blurred. So if we carry on either a little bit of stick blending, or I'll typically just sit and stir and wait for my batter, we'll then quite quickly come to this thin trace. And can you see, if we look quite carefully, now the batter's thickened sufficiently that when you drop the soap back in, you can actually see it drawing or tracing a little pattern on the surface. Now this pattern isn't going to hang around, it's going to disappear quite quickly, but it will initially start off being there, and that's how we know we've got a thin trace. So should we pour now? Well, it depends. What is it that you want to do? A thin trace is pretty good for those designs that rely on the way that you pour something into a mould to get the design. And especially if you've got a more complicated pour, something like a dancing funnel, clamshell, or a pointy layers technique, those types of things. So if we continue to stick blend or just wait for a little bit longer, we'll then come across our medium type trace, so that's slightly thicker trace. And at this stage what you should find is, again, you should be able to drop your batter onto the surface, but I tend to think of medium trace is at the point where the batter will stay on the surface and it will sit there, but when you bang the mould down it will completely disappear. But unlike a thin trace, it won't just vanish on its own. Now, medium trace is great in a number of situations. Firstly, if you want to start suspending anything in your soap, so maybe something like a confetti soap, or if you've got some sort of exfoliant in your soap. But it's also great for when you start doing those swirls that are actually aided by some sort of tool. So something like a skewer swirl, a spoon swirl, a hanger swirl. And then let's move on to our thick trace. Now to me, a thick trace is when your batter's kind of got past the point of pouring and you're looking at spooning or blopping it, for want of a technical term, into the mould. So therefore, as you can see here, it sort of clings onto my spatula and I can actually mould it and shape it in the pot. It will definitely hold a trace if you leave it on its own, and even if you bang your pot down, it's quite likely that you wouldn't still at that point get a completely smooth surface. So what do we use a thick trace for? Well, you can still get some really decent swirls with a thick trace, as long as you can get it into the mould and it's not too thick that it's going to create air bubbles. You can get some brilliant hanger swirls and things, especially if you've got a slightly thicker hanger. I tend to use a thicker trace when I'm doing some sort of sculpted type soap. So maybe I want some sort of layer that I'll want to shape before I pour some more batter on top. Okay, so those are all our different types of trace, but please remember trace is actually a sliding scale and there's no actual specific stops for this is your medium trace, this is your thick trace, and you may find that different people class different thicknesses in different ways. You need to think about what works for you. I often find as well that I'll work between the types of thicknesses. So for example, one of my favourite thicknesses to work out is partway between a thin and a medium trace. And that's really great for getting swirls. Things like drop swirls are brilliant at that sort of trace because you've still got the nice flow on the batter, but you've got enough thickness to give you a good definition between your colours. And then lastly, moving on to acceleration. So what is acceleration? Well, if you imagine if you just literally had your pure soap batter on its own and did nothing to it, acceleration is when something happens to it, or you do something to it, or you add something to it that makes the trace thicken quicker than if it was just left on its own. So some of the most common things that can cause acceleration are the recipe that you're using, the type of oils, and also the amount of water that you use. If you do a water discount, you will find that your recipe will trace and accelerate quicker than if you use full water. The amount of stick blending that you do, the temperature that you're soaping at, fragrance and essential oils that you use, and also the colorants that you're using or any other types of additives. Now, I'm not going to spend time talking about all the different types of oils and their properties. That's far too vast a subject to try and squeeze into a video where we're just supposed to be talking about trace. But we are going to have a look at the other bits and pieces. So first of all, stick blending. Now, we've spent most of this video, haven't we, talking about stick blending and how you use a blender to increase the amount of trace. One thing that I just want to advise you is make sure that you make yourself an expert at spotting emulsion. Don't be one of those people that always has to just give it one more pulse on the stick blender to make sure it's emulsified, because then it's quite likely you're going to blend too much. Also remember with your trace and your stick blending, sometimes it's better to just wait. I will typically take my batters to emulsion and then I'll not stick blend after that point, and I'll just wait it out, gradually stirring until the batter's got to the exact consistency that I want. If you try and stick blend to the exact consistency that you want, it is very likely that you'll stick blend too much and then your batter will continue to accelerate. For temperature, typically the hotter you soap at, the faster your batter will move. But temperature is again one of those things that is a personal preference, and some temperatures will work better for some recipes than others. And because my recipe always tends to get a bit of false trace if I go as low as room temperature, I always choose to soap between 80 and 95 degrees. And I will tweak that temperature. If I want a batter and I want it to remain really fluid, I'll make sure I soap right at the lowest end of that range. If I want something that I want a little bit thicker and I want it to hurry up and move along a bit, I'll soap at the higher end of that range. Bear in mind, if you do soap at low temperatures, you may get a nice fluid batter, but the payoff can often be that you end up with stearic acid spots in your soap. And those are like little white blobby bits that appear from the oils solidifying before the soap has actually saponified. The addition of a fragrance or an essential oil can be the thing that most dramatically affects your trace. And therefore it's always really important to test a new fragrance oil before you use it in a big batch of soap. If you're unsure how to do this, I've actually got a full video about testing fragrance oils for all sorts of things like acceleration and discoloration, and I'm going to link that in the description below. So what I'm doing here is just showing you a little example of how fragrance oils can affect the speed of your trace. So I've measured out identical amounts of soap batter from the same batch, and I'm going to add the fragrance oil at a rate of 5% of total oils, just because that's a really common rate that people tend to use. And then we'll see how they behave. So I've mixed in both of my fragrance oils, and I actually started with the one that doesn't accelerate trace first, so that's been longest in the pot. And then already, as soon as I start mixing in the accelerating one, I can see the batter starting to thicken up. So I let them both sit for just exactly 10 seconds and went back and stirred again, and you can see the first one nice and runny still. And then the second one is quite considerably thicker. And then a little rest for another 15 seconds this time, and again fairly runny on the first one. And good old soap on a stick on the second. And then if we just take the temperature of both of them, you can see there's really quite a significant difference as well. So that non-accelerating fragrance is about 79–80 degrees. But the accelerating one is already up to 127 degrees. So should you avoid accelerating fragrance oils? Well, it depends. As far as I'm concerned, you have to know the characteristics of your oils and then you can choose whether you want to use them or not. And accelerating fragrance oils do have their place. If you're doing a simple design and the fragrance oil has a brilliant scent, or they can be really useful in some cases. For example, if like you're doing a layered soap, you can put the fragrance oil into the batter at the last possible moment, pour the layer, it then sets up really quick, and then you can pour the next layer on top of that. And then lastly, let's look at colourants. So I've just got 3 colourants here. I've got just a yellow mica, I've got some titanium dioxide dispersed in oil, and I've also got a turquoisey blue which has some ultramarine blue in it. And again, I'm treating them all exactly the same quantity of soap batter. I've made sure I've dispersed them all in exactly the same amount of oils, and obviously they're all at exactly the same temperature. Now, you shouldn't expect such a drastic reaction as you would with maybe a fragrance oil, but you will potentially see some acceleration. Now, I have left these sitting for about 10 to 15 minutes, and you can see the yellow is still pretty fluid. That blue is actually quite thick now, definitely gone beyond a medium trace and now moving more into a thick trace. And the titanium dioxide has thickened up a little bit as well. So yes, you will find that some colourants will accelerate your trace, and you just really need to get used to what certain colourants do and take notes. When you find that you are mixing up some colours and one seems to be thicker than another, write it down, and so therefore you'll be prepared next time you use it. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found the content useful. If you've got any questions or queries, then please just pop them down in the comments box below and I'll get back to you. If you did enjoy the video, it would be great if you gave me a thumbs up, and why not consider subscribing to my channel so you can see what I'm up to in the future. Thanks for watching everyone, happy soaping!